record the meeting. You just heard that. Thank you. Right on cue. And that's so we can let others review the event later. My name is Ken Lawler. I am the chair of the Fair 6 Georgia Foundation. We got a great program for you tonight. As you're joining, please make sure you identify yourself in the chat with your name. Excuse me, not in the chat, but as in the event with your name, as opposed to, iPhone number 7. That would be great. You'll be able to enter questions in the chat as we go this evening. We will endeavor to take as many questions as we can from the audience with our distinguished author guest this evening. Please let us know where you're coming from. So go ahead and practice with the chat and plug in your location. Let us know where you're joining from. We'd like to see that we have a nice cross-section across the state of Georgia. Sometimes we get folks from other states as well who are interested in what's going on in Georgia. So please go ahead and start letting us know in the chat where you're from. Appreciate that. And again, we're going to record this event and be thinking of your questions for our guest speaker, who we'll introduce in just a moment. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and put up the billboard for the evening so we know what we're doing here.
They're just documenting their outreach, I guess.
Mm-hmm. What just happened?
He's testing out the PowerPoint, I think.
Oh, okay. That's
right.
I get it.
Right.
So, I do a ridiculous.
All right. David Daly joining us from Western Massachusetts. Thank you, David, for coming. DeKalb, Georgia, Decatur from Atlanta, Brunswick, Georgia. All right, great. Alpharetta, a couple people from Alpharetta. That's where I am from, is Alpharetta. Dunwoody, thank you for joining. Elizabeth from Decatur. Got the convention in the background. Well, listen, you're tuning into the better program, at least for now. David from Suwanee. Thanks for joining, David. So again, if you're just now joining, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, just telling us where you're calling in from, you're viewing from. We have a great program for you tonight. It's one of our, we haven't had town halls in a little bit, but we are having a very, very exciting town hall this evening with Mr. Daly, which we'll introduce in just a second here. So let's see, how many folks do we have in Victoria Kane? Welcome, Victoria. Roswell, hey, Cameron, welcome, brother. Mableton, Georgia. Stone Mountain, beautiful. Beautiful. How many folks do we have in now? I can't see the total list. We have to around 30 or so.
We have 34 on right now, Ken.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, when we get to 35, that's the magic number. We're gonna start at 35. I'm just making that up. So let me know when we get to 35 and we'll give it a start here. As you see, our program this evening is really focused on our guest speaker, Mr. David Daly. David is the author of this new book called Anti-Democratic. He has written other books as well. He's been with us before, actually. David was a member of a panel that we had in March of 2023. That town hall is viewable online, and I think we'll put a link in there for those of you who want to view that. That panel discussed the results of the midterm election and the perspective on how did gerrymandering affect the congressional midterm across the country. We had people from all over the country in that town hall. He's also been with us before in September with an Advocacy Day introduction. David is the author of this new book, Anti-Democratic. He's also the author of a couple other books. The first book I shouldn't pronounce the full name of, but it's called Rat Effed. You'll know what that means. Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, which has been credited for kickstarting the fight to end gerrymandering. He wrote a follow-up book called Unrigged, about how people are fighting back. That includes us. We are fighting back, of course. David has been around. He's a chronicler of this story for many years, and one of the better writers who really understands how all this stuff happens. His journalism has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, among other publications. He's the former editor-in-chief of Salon, a senior fellow at Fair Vote, has taught political science and journalism as a visiting fellow at Wesleyan University, Smith College, Boston College, and the University of Georgia. David, welcome. Just before you start, I want to mention to folks, I think you're already aware of this, but we are raffling off 5 signed copies of David's book tonight. If you have donated $25 to our event this evening through Eventbrite, you are eligible. We are holding the eligibility open for all contributions made until 7:30. So it's your deadline is at 7:30. If you want to go ahead and actually buy a second ticket, we've had a couple people in the raffle who are very eager to get the book. They bought 2 tickets, so they all have 2 chances in the random number drawing, which we will conduct at the close of the program. If you'd like to go ahead and if you like what you're hearing from David and says, I really need to read his book, hey, try out the raffle. You'll have a good shot at getting it since we're giving away 5. And those of you, when we do the raffle at the end, we will call out your email addresses and then we'll communicate on how to get the books sent out to you. I'll tell you that I've been reading the book, and this book is chock full of a story that needs to be told. And so without further ado, David, tell us the story. Tell us about Antidemocratic.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fair Districts. I love the work you all do. It's been a pleasure to be with you, to be allies in this fight with you for so many years. I love Georgia. That's REM behind me because we've got to have a little bit of Georgia on the walls at all time. And let's get this raffle moving. Tell you what, I will match the next 4. If we get 4 names in here in the next few minutes, I will match that. So I am really excited to be here. So this book is long, and it could be longer. Isn't that a great way to start? Listen, when you draw the lines, you make the rules. That's why we're all here, right? Because we understand the connection between the field on which elections take place and who wins, who loses, and sometimes who doesn't even get to play. And the story that I'm trying to tell here really is a twinned story, that there's 2 things that happened in the 1960s to begin to even the playing field. The Warren Court at the Supreme Court, the apportionment revolution, applies the concept of 1 person, 1 vote to redistricting. It insists that congressional and state legislative districts be drawn to equal population sizes. This is really important, of course, because before our war on gerrymandering that we are all enlisted in, politicians gerrymandered simply just by not redistricting at all. Redistricting had been ignored in most states over the previous 6 decades, and as a result, districts were dramatically unequal, and that perpetuated inequality. You look at what your neighbors in Alabama were doing at the time. Alabama's legislative system allowed 1 senator per county. So if you think about that, right, not only is that a very unequal population size, but it's a terrific way to ensure that the rural areas, the whiter areas, have a whole lot more power than the cities. Not the only example. You look at a state like Nevada, the smallest district had 568 people. The largest had about 127,000. The court finally said, no more, you can't do that. Second thing, of course, is the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And it took that legislation for Dr. King's moral arc of the universe to bend toward justice once again. It needed to be wrested back from places like Selma, where marchers faced tear gas and attack dogs, all for asserting a fundamental constitutional right that was assured but not enforced. And to ensure that this time that right would stick in the most stubborn and resistant localities where neither judges nor local officials could be trusted, the Voting Rights Act required the most horrific offenders, those who met the idea of equality with fire hoses, to pre-approve any changes to election laws or voting procedures with the Department of Justice or a federal court in Washington, D.C. This became known as preclearance. It was the most creative and essential enforcement mechanism that provided the muscle to the Voting Rights Act's ideals. Anti-democratic really is about the backlash over the last 5 decades to the Warren Court and to the Voting Rights Act, and how those forces that like the power that comes from making the rules, who resist a multiracial nation blossoming into a multiracial democracy, have found the pressure points, like redistricting, like the courts, to unravel these hard-won protections. The consequences are real, they're dramatic, they affect all of us, and they could have a huge impact on the presidential election this fall. The backlash begins days after the Voting Rights Act's passage. Immediately, South Carolina protests. They file a case known as the Katzenbach case, September of 1965. They say the Voting Rights Act intrudes on our sovereignty and things have changed here. We don't need it. The Warren Court, not unsurprisingly, says no. And they add that equal sovereignty among states is not a thing, which is an important factor to remember as we get closer to current times. What Earl Warren writes in that decision, upholding the Voting Rights Act and preclearance, is that Congress felt itself confronted by an insidious and pervasive evil, which had been perpetuated in certain parts of our country through unremitting and ingenious defiance of the Constitution. Unremitting and ingenious defiance of the Constitution. 4 years later, there's another case, additional ingenious defiance. They wrap these 4 cases together in what's known as Allen versus State Board. The Voting Rights Act, again, is upheld. Earl Warren writes that it was aimed at the subtle as well as the obvious state regulations that have the effect of denying citizens their right to vote. And then Earl Warren steps down. A funny thing happens. The justices who replace folks on that court have less commitment to voting rights. An important lesson here: when the justices change, so can the law. By the late 1970s, the early 1980s, the court had begun to evolve. There's an important case from Mobile, Alabama, Mobile v. Bolden, it's called. This is a challenge to the at-large districts that the city of Mobile was using. Mobile was the second largest city in the state, had one of the largest Black populations in the nation, and yet it had never elected a Black candidate because of the way that at-large districts work. If everybody is voting for 4 people at large, and you have racially polarized voting, the majority group is going to win every single seat every single time. Folks in Alabama who were designing these districts back after the Alabama Constitution, designed to ensure white supremacy in the state, was passed in 1901, roundly admitted what their intent was. And in this case, the really brave federal judge, Judge Pittman, he walks the city and he sees the inequality that comes from no representation. He sees how the schools are different, how the sidewalks are different, the drainage system. He takes a look at the golf courses in the city that had to be, the bus station, all of which had to be desegregated effectively by court order. And he says, we're going to change to a system of districts, and these districts have to be drawn to ensure that everybody has a say. The Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to do that. And that decision is led by Justice Lewis Powell. And Powell effectively says, come on, we've been doing it this way for years. This is simply the way it is. Who has a problem with at-large districts? These rules had been the rules for so long that what they enforced had really become almost invisible. And so what the court says in this decision is that you have to prove racial intent if you want to overturn a voting procedure. You can't just show a racial effect. That you could actually show intent and effect here is ignored by these justices. 1982, the Voting Rights Act is reauthorized. Republican Senate, Democratic House, and they make clear in the reauthorization that what the Voting Rights Act meant was intent and effect. And they amend the legislation to ensure that that Supreme Court decision is countermanded. That effort is opposed by a handful of forces inside the Department of Justice at the time, who were led by a 26-year-old assistant by the name of John Roberts. This is John Roberts's first job in Washington. He is a very young man, just out of Harvard Law School, just out of clerking at the Supreme Court. Roberts's side would lose in this case. It is very hard to defeat the Voting Rights Act. It's very popular. It's as American as motherhood and apple pie and baseball. And there was an important lesson that was learned here by those who would prefer to see the clock turn back on voting rights, that it's very difficult to get to 218 votes, 51 in the Senate, and to have a president lined up against this. That anybody who runs for office is going to tend to be on the side of making it easy to vote. But they realized it would be a whole lot easier to make these changes if they had 5 justices on the US Supreme Court. By 2005, one of those justices would be young John Roberts. Roberts is nominated to replace Sandra Day O'Connor upon her death, and then moves into the Chief's chair when Bill Rehnquist dies a few days later. And Roberts promises that he's going to be an umpire. He's going to just call balls and strikes. He talks in his confirmation hearings about his boyhood in Indiana, remembering farms that stretched to the horizon. And then he uses baseball as America's civic religion. He embraces this image that I'm going to call balls and strikes. It's an image that he's embraced, but I would suggest that it's counter to the reality, as we'll talk about in these upcoming Voting Rights Act cases. Roberts simply was never attuned to Voting Rights Act, to voting rights in general. And this could be his background. His Indiana boyhood was not exactly, as he said, the town of Long Beach, where he grew up, is not exactly a farm town, but a fairly wealthy Chicago suburb. It was one of the most segregated cities in the nation, and quite intentionally so. It marketed itself that way as a highly restricted home community where all residents are Caucasian Gentiles. He has summer jobs that paid between $16 and $21 an hour at his dad's company. It's about the equivalent of a summer job paying between $80 and $100 now. And so Roberts is not exactly calling balls and strikes on voting rights. In 2006, the Voting Rights Act is reauthorized, the same time that Roberts is having his confirmation hearings. The Congress is also engaged in the most dramatic and consequential process of hearings that the Congress has ever taken part in. They generate a 16,000-page record. And the Voting Rights Act is reauthorized almost unanimously in a Republican Congress, 390 to 33 in the House, 98 to nothing in the Senate, signed back into law by President George W. Bush. And the goal of all of that work was to tell the court that we still mean that preclearance is necessary, that intent and effect is necessary, that there is still ingenious defiance that has to be defeated. And they find example after example after example. It would take the US Supreme Court, though, to pull the nation backwards. And the most important case here, which I talk a lot about in the book, is Shelby County versus Holder. This is a case that starts not far from Selma in a tiny town called Calera, which is part of Shelby County. It starts with a district line that no one can see. It's an invisible boundary that wrapped around a new Walmart. It bisects Interstate 65 at the very center of Alabama, and it stretched the Calera City Council district that Ernest Montgomery represented away from the growing city's downtown. The political consequences of this line would soon be revealed. Montgomery was just the second Black official elected in Calera's history. He represented the only majority Black district in town. This invisible line, which was kept secret from the Department of Justice, despite the requirements of the Voting Rights Act, It turned his district from 71% black to nearly 70% white. That's redistricting that turns a district completely inside out. In the next election, Montgomery lost his seat by 2 votes. A lot of those old hatreds had remained hidden underneath Calera's growth. As the city had boomed, it made 177 annexations between 1993 and 2006. Every change in the size and shape of a city, of course, the decisions about which neighborhoods to annex and which ones not to, alters the voting strength of residents. Those have to be pre-cleared. They were not pre-cleared. Calera just hadn't done it. They did not pre-clear the new maps. They did not pre-clear any of the annexations. When the Department of Justice learned this, it sent the city a 3-page letter. They made it clear that no valid election could be held on an uncleared map with uncleared annexations. Calera goes ahead anyway. Pre-clearance gave the Department of Justice the power to void the election and to force the city to run the race again under the old maps. This time, Montgomery is reelected by a commanding margin. Now, you might look at the Calera elections and conclude that pre-clearance had done its job in Shelby County, that the Voting Rights Act had caught and prevented a subtle yet brazen effort that would have ensured an entirely white council. It was working as lawmakers had intended in 1965, protecting against continued discrimination, very much alive 50 years later. That is not how officials in Shelby County saw it. They decided they would bring a constitutional challenge to the notion of pre-clearance. And so in Shelby County versus Holder, that 2-mile arc that cut Montgomery's district from its historical moorings also ensures the Voting Rights Act. John Roberts, it turns out, had been planning for this very day when the Voting Rights Act would return to his courtroom. 3 years earlier, a test case called Northwest Austin allowed Roberts to carefully plant the seeds for Shelby County. A tiny municipal water board in a new Texas development posed a large constitutional question. It insisted it bore no responsibility for racial voting suppression, that they were a new district. They'd had no history of this at all. And so they challenged pre-clearance. They said, we shouldn't have to be a part of this. Why should we be punished for things we did not do? 2 lower federal courts agreed that the utility district could not bail out and that pre-clearance remained a fair response by Congress. The racial disparities revealed in the 2006 legislative record differ little from what Congress found in 1965, wrote the federal appeals court judge David Tatel. We see no constitutional basis for rejecting Congress's considered judgment. Before Tatel wrote his decision, he read every page of the 2006 congressional report. All the more impressive because David Tatel is blind. That report detailed the shocking stories of canceled elections and last-second precinct switches, voter purges across Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and the other covered states. He did this, he told me, because he had no confidence that the Supreme Court would ever look at the record. His fears were justified. During oral arguments in April 2009, Roberts expressed impatience, sounded like he simply didn't believe these challenges continued. Well, he said, that's like the old elephant whistle when told of pre-clearance's importance. You know, I have this whistle to keep away the elephants. There are no elephants, so it must work. No one doubts the history here, he added, but at what point does that history stop justifying action? When do they have to stop? I mean, at some point it begins to look like this is going to go on forever. Many members of the court wanted to move on. Several appeared ready to reach the larger constitutional issues. Roberts brokers a deal. He writes an apparently unifying decision for a court that had seemed deeply divided. Everybody won, sort of. The water district would be allowed to bail out. Other small entities could apply for a reprieve, but pre-clearance survived for the moment. Roberts appeared to have done the impossible. He won praise from the media for his judicial statesmanship. In reality, he was digging a trench and setting a trap. The liberal justices who were so eager to reach a compromise and see pre-clearance continue, they barely seem to notice the actual language of the deal that they made. Things have changed in the South, Roberts declared, writing for the entire court. The VRA, he wrote, imposes current burdens and must be justified by current needs. Roberts had conned the liberals into signing on to a broad indictment of that need, aimed at a future case and a future decision. Then Roberts made one additional stealth play that helped assure the next challenge to the VRA would arise quickly and aided its success. He made an observation known as dicta, a comment that might not be necessary to resolve a case or even be legally binding, but that can be cited as a persuasive authority. This is where he gives birth to the fiction of a fundamental principle of equal sovereignty among states. Remember back to the Katzenbach decision. The fundamental problem with that principle is that it does not exist. Roberts creates it with an ellipsis and what can only be read as a deliberate misapplication of the law. How does he do this? This is what the Katzenbach decision says. In acceptable legislative fashion, Congress chose to limit its attention to the geographic areas where immediate action seemed necessary. The doctrine of the equality of states invoked by South Carolina does not bar this approach, for that doctrine applies only to the terms upon which states are admitted to the Union and not to the remedies for local evils which have subsequently appeared. Here's what Roberts writes. The act also differentiates between the states, despite our historic tradition, citing himself, that all states enjoy equal sovereignty. Distinctions can be barred in some cases, and he writes that the doctrine of the equality of states, ... does not bar ... remedies for local evils which have subsequently appeared. He cuts out the entire part that says this is only to do upon the terms that states are admitted to the Union.
Hey, David, I'm going to break in for just a
Yeah,
moment if I
You got
could.
it.
Just for a second. It's a great story. I'm just going to remind folks that the deadline for purchasing the last raffle tickets is 2 minutes away. Again, if you want to go back to the Eventbrite event and buy an extra ticket, or if you didn't buy the $25 upgrade ticket, we appreciate the contributions, and you'll be entered into the raffle for the 5 signed copies of David's book, which we'll be raffling off at the end of the program. David, I do want to get to some questions and answers. I know you have some very large ground to cover. You probably have a couple more big cases you have to get in front of the group here, so as they understand the
Yeah,
impacts.
give me 5 more minutes and I'll wrap it up.
I know, go ahead. And folks, please feel free to start putting your questions in the chat and we will get to those. Back to you, Mr. Daly.
So Shelby County finishes the job that Northwest Austin began. Things had changed in the South. The pre-clearance formula had become outdated, no longer met current conditions. Robert wrote, he brushes aside the lengthy congressional record that's filled with all the modern day examples, singling out states for disparate treatment. He failed to accord each state its equal sovereignty. The conservative judge and legal scholar Richard Posner looked at this and says, this is a principle of constitutional law which I had never heard, for the excellent reason that there is no such principle. What Roberts didn't make up, he got wrong. He based his reasoning that things had changed on voter registration statistics that to him showed that blacks and whites had reached something close to parity, and that in some states, blacks had even surpassed whites. He includes a chart ostensibly documenting this. The chart gets the statistics backwards. They did not show what they said he did. In many cases, they showed the opposite, came from a misunderstanding of on Roberts's part of how the census reported race. When reporters asked the court to explain how he could have gotten these statistics wrong, the chief declined to answer questions. The court does not comment on its opinions, he said, which speak for themselves. The one argument that he had in his favor, progress viewed through a narrowing gap in white and black voter turnout, dissolved upon the decision. In March of 2024, the Brennan Center releases a study on the growing racial turnout disparities. The difference in voting rates between white and non-white voters grew steadily over a dozen years, and fastest in the states where the Chief Justice removed the federal oversight. It didn't take a decade of study to confirm what happened immediately after the decision, though. It became apparent immediately. States had laws ready, laws that they knew would not pass pre-clearance. They waited for the courts to take it away. The Republican Congressman James Sensenbrenner told me that the guard was taken away from the gates of the prison and they all ran out. Within minutes of the Shelby County decision, Texas enacted its new voter ID bill, the most stringent in the nation, passed prior to Shelby County, but blocked unanimously by a 3-judge federal panel that had found it would disenfranchise minorities and the poor. It was allowed to go into effect immediately. The legislative sessions that followed Shelby County showed it all to be a deep folly. State by state, lawmakers became more brazen. This was a court-enabled opportunity to seize power. It set into motion the array of ballot suppression measures that have rendered the simple act of voting difficult for too many Americans, because something else had happened at the same time, right? These gerrymanders across so many states, the most intense gerrymanders in our nation's history, blessed by the court in later decisions that decade. States like Georgia, 50-50 statewide elections at the presidential level, 2 Democratic senators, Republican statewide officers, very close to the presidential level, not at all close in the state legislature. Gerrymandering makes things unfair, and then it exacerbates the extremes because it elevates primaries and uncompetitive districts to be the most important races. You end up with more extreme lawmakers than free to enact changes that would have needed to have been pre-cleared in previous years. Let me just leave you on this one point, because Georgia's in the news these days for what's happening, and it's in these state election panels having to do with certification of election results. What's happening there right now would not have been okay under the old system. These would have been changes to election procedures that would have needed to have been pre-cleared. Now they do not need to be pre-cleared, and indeed it appears, according to the news coverage, that these boards have been captured by some pretty extreme forces. What it could enable is a process by which this election finds its way back to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I think it's kind of interesting and quite a place to leave it, that a decision by the Supreme Court to end pre-clearance a decade ago makes it possible in some ways for the possibility of this election being litigated again by the U.S. Supreme Court. And if we do find ourselves in a situation that Bush versus Gore is being repeated in 2000, on election day, November 5th, about 180 million of us are likely to vote. If we end up with a replay of Bush versus Gore, it's all going to be in the hands of just 9. So that I think is a pretty chilling possibility, but eminently real. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. I'll tell you that David has shown you the tip of the iceberg of the material that's in the book. It is here's the book again. Like I'm pitching books for you. The history of how we got to this moment is so long. I'm finding it fascinating that the one person, one vote principle is only 60 years old in this country. You would think it goes back to the founders, but no. 60 years ago, that principle was founded. And then the Voting Rights Act passes. And we've had an upswing in progress along those lines. But now here we are on the downside, right? And that's kind of the story you're telling in the book. Really is about how that all is being eroded even as we speak. I want to talk about Georgia for a second, as you already talked about it. But we were able to resolve in favor of fair racial voting districts last year. All right, we had 3 cases that went under the Voting Rights Act, went into federal court. They relied on a very positive decision that we got from the Supreme Court from Alabama. It's called Allen v. Milligan. I'm sure people know it. But that decision basically said, you have to pay attention to the Voting Rights Act. If you can draw Black majority districts according to the rules that the court has laid down in prior decisions, you have to do it. So Georgia did it. Now, they also threw in some partisan gerrymandering, which we didn't like. But at the end of the day, our congressional, state house, state senate maps are fairer to Black voters now than they were when they were drawn in 2021. However, I'm concerned, and I'm sure you are too. There is another decision from South Carolina that looks like it's going the other way. And I'm curious, David, to ask you to predict or prognosticate, how does the court resolve, on the one hand, in the Alabama case, which also got applied, I think, to Louisiana and Georgia, that the Voting Rights Act is hereby upheld? It was a great surprise on the positive side. How do they reconcile that versus the decision in South Carolina where I think they said, you don't have to have racial parity in your congressional districts. Explain that logic to me. I don't get it. And what happens next? Where do we go?
It's a great question, and I don't have the easiest answer. What I would point you towards is history. What this court has done over 15 years, and I tell the stories of all of these cases in the book, is they don't want to just shred the Voting Rights Act either, because the Voting Rights Act is popular. And so the court moves slowly on these cases. They begin with a half step that nobody notices, and indeed sometimes people even applaud. But that case usually lays the groundwork for the next case. When it comes to voting rights, John Roberts reminds me of that old Johnny Cash song, One Piece at a Time, in which they don't steal the car, but they take a piece of it every day and slowly assemble it. And they get it for free. Or it's democracy is the frog in the boiling pot, with the temperature being turned up slowly. The important thing to notice in the Alabama decision is not what the court decided in the majority opinion. The important thing is Brett Kavanaugh's concurrence, in which Kavanaugh says, well, this case in front of us is so obvious that we have to come to this conclusion. But a lot of us think that perhaps time has run out on the need for protections against racial gerrymandering, because it's not 1965 anymore. Right, it's a very similar argument that was being made in Shelby County. And Kavanaugh says, but we just can't consider that in this case because nobody's made that argument. So it's kind of an open invitation. Well, if somebody simply makes the argument that maybe we don't need these protections anymore, we might be open to the case that dismantles them. Now, if it seems a little bit preposterous to you that cases in which the court is finding that this is still necessary also contain the seeds where they say, maybe we don't need this anymore, then you have entered the mind of some of these justices. So I think that is the important thing, right? It's remembering that before Citizens United, there's a case called Wisconsin Right to Life that lays the groundwork. Before Shelby County, there's Northwest Austin laying the groundwork. Before Common Cause versus Rucho on partisan gerrymandering, there's Gill versus Whitford. There's always one that comes before, in Rocky Horror Picture Show parlance, there's the step and then the jump. And I think that what you saw in the Alabama case might have been the step.
Okay, great. We're going to open the floor to questions from our audience. I think Beth Stevenson is going to join the spotlighting here. We've got some interesting questions from the audience. Beth, why don't you put out a couple good ones, and let's see if we can stump Mr. Daly.
Thanks, Ken. So we have a question that came in that said, basically, what you were describing seems intentionally criminal. And is there no just remedy? Any thoughts on sort of solutions, or what do we do?
We reform the Supreme Court. I mean, I opened the book with this quote from Lincoln's first inaugural. The candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. I think what Lincoln had to say in 1861 holds true today. I think that this court on voting rights, but also on some other issues, of course, has made itself into, has made it a Congress of 9 sitting above the actual elected Congress, and has is no longer simply a co-equal branch of government, because the 2 other branches of government generated a 16,000-page report that says we still need this, and those 9 people decided no, we don't, without any of their own research or evidence, based on law that was not law and facts that were simply wrong, and unleashed real consequences upon our politics. So, you know, they have jobs for life. The only way to remove them is through impeachment. But there are some interesting proposals on the table about term limits, about ethics codes, neither of which currently exist, and but that huge majorities of Americans favor. Something like 73% of Americans back term limits, 78% back an ethics code. So that's Republicans, Democrats, Independents. That's across the. I think that there's a lot of Americans who are concerned about the idea of ceasing to be their own rulers.
Thank
wanna-
you.
I want to follow up on that question with another angle on it, if I could, which is reforming the court. Obviously, lots of energy around that. If they've set a trap, let's say, that's going to dismantle the Voting Rights Act at some point, right? Or they've already dismantled a good chunk of it, right? Can the act be repaired, or is the trap inescapable? In other words, if Congress got their act together, and we could advocate for Congress, and we could get Congress to pass a new Voting Rights Act, or there's a new thing called the Redistricting Reform Act, which was introduced in this year by Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota, which is going to go nowhere until next year, maybe. But they're trying, right? The question is, are these traps inescapable in your mind? Or if we fix the law, can we also wiggle our way out of the problem? What is your
I
thought?
think that the trick is that it's really difficult to fix the law given the realities of Congress. Given the gerrymandering that's been involved, given the way that the Senate is so grossly malapportioned, it's very difficult. And Roberts in the Shelby County decision, he invites Congress to come up with a new preclearance formula. But he does so, I think, knowing that it would not be possible. And indeed, I went and interviewed a bunch of the members from that period of time, and they said no, it was dead on arrival. There were a lot of lawmakers who did not want to be on record as voting against the Voting Rights Act, but they were thrilled that the court did it for them. And so they were happy to take the knife with somebody else's fingerprints and consider the murder complete. So yes, Congress could do something. All the forces have to line up for Congress to do something. I mean, it wasn't enough to do anything when Democrats had trifectas back in 2021. If they land another trifecta, they'd have to find a way to do it then, that the filibuster gets in the way. So it's certainly not impossible, but it feels like a little bit of a triple bank shot. But triple bank shots sometimes go in.
Thank you. There was a quick question, which I just wanted to bring up, came about the comments about the Georgia Election Board. And don't know if this is in your ballpark, but the question was, can the Georgia Election Board decisions that might be askew be appealed? Any thoughts on that? And that may be something that we need to continue to ponder, since it's actively happening now.
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I'm sure there's smarter people on this call who do. I would think that it's a long process, unfortunately, but and you don't have a lot of time. And that's the trick here, you know. I mean, you've got the election, what, November 5th. States have to have ratification by December 11, and then the Electoral College meets December 17. So if your goal is to sow chaos, time is sort of on your side. You just want to try to slow the process down as much as you can. And then if you slow the process down, a couple of things could happen. State legislatures could conceivably appoint alternate slates of electors. There could be no electors from a state that would then lower the threshold of electoral votes down from 538 to, let's say this happens in Wisconsin and those 10 come down, then you just need a majority of 528. There's lots of nefarious, interesting ways that this could go. And people are thinking about it. The folks who were thinking about it last time were not sending their best and brightest. And this time there's not going to be a press conference in front of the Four Seasons Landscaping. There's some really sharp lawyers and minds who have been thinking about this for a long time.
I think the pinch point would come, to be honest, when the Secretary of State and the election laws say that counties have to certify their vote like within a week. That's for all the elections, for the state house, everything, right? So if they fail, then you end up in a Georgia court situation where the Secretary of State or somebody is suing these counties saying, where's your vote count, right? And it gets wrapped up in a Georgia court situation. And let's say hopefully resolved favorably before we get to Electoral College County, but that could be a mess. It could be a mess.
It could be appealed for weeks.
Right, right.
And it could ultimately land in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and then it becomes an independent state legislative theory case in some ways, if you remember Moore v. Harper. It gets depressing to ponder all of this, but I think we have to be clear-eyed. I think we were all taken a little bit by surprise last time that all of these little boards we'd never heard of played such a significant role. I don't think we can enter the 5 weeks between Election Day and the Electoral College quite so naive this time.
There are actually a number of questions and they're in the chat, and we might be able to sort of get back to some of these folks. There's a question where I think as we're kind of entering into sort of maybe some of the final conversation is sort of what's a voter to do? We're in the middle of election season, and campaigns and candidates need money to get their message out, even if it's statistically impossible for that candidate to get elected, talking about gerrymandering and other things. That seems criminal too. Would some mass lawsuit help move the gerrymander needle? I mean, it's sort of a lot of questions, but I think the answer is, what, as voters, we're here now, what are some of the things that we might do?
There's been so many fascinating victories by voters across the country, and I chronicled a lot of them in my last book. What Michigan did on redistricting, by going out and winning a statewide initiative, what folks did in Idaho, what they're working on right now again in Idaho, running a play for open primaries and a top 5 system that is I think really interesting, that it has a lot of promise to take our politics back from the extremes on both sides and really bring it back into the center again. Maine and Alaska are using something similar to this right now, and it's worked out really well. When voters come together, whether it's for redistricting reform or whether it's for ranked choice voting or for felony reenfranchisement in Florida a few years ago, voters win. I think that there's no hurdle that can't be surmounted when we all come together and fight for free and fair elections. But it's a fight, right? I mean, Dr. King talked about the moral arc of the universe being long and bending towards justice, but it only bends towards justice when we all grab it together and pull it in that direction. And we got to remember that there's other people who've got their hands on it, who are sometimes in a better position than us, who are trying to pull the other way. And that push and pull, which I try to make this case in the book, that push and pull is the story of America in many ways. We don't ever get to the end of these fights, and our job as citizens is to stay engaged and to continue fighting our version of them. Our version of this fight is not as difficult as what had to be done in Selma in 1965. It's not as difficult as what had to be done, a period of the Civil War. Our job is to stand up and fight for what is right in this moment. And it's doable, right? I mean, democracy is not a noun. Democracy is a verb, something that we have to work on together and perfect within ourselves and work at every single day.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question, Ken?
Yes, I think we do.
Okay, let me go on up here to, let's see. We had a question about the South Carolina decision that was made, and it seems like the intent aspect is still okay, but the effect portion has been dropped. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, the beauty of intent versus effects is that it's complicated. And lawmakers who have racial intent don't usually leave memos or emails saying exactly what they're doing. So it's a very difficult standard to reach. After Mobile v. Bolden put that standard into effect, it pretty much brought the Justice Department's enforcement to a screeching halt. They simply weren't able to do anything because they didn't, well, there was no email then, so that they didn't have any emails. But it was very difficult to find the memos that would prove this. So, and that has only gotten more difficult, again, because of the half step that the court made in this direction in the Common Cause versus Rucho case. And Ken is smiling because he knows where I'm going with this. When the courts said that racial gerrymandering was still not okay, but that it was fine to do a partisan gerrymander, what they effectively allowed was legislatures to do a racial gerrymander if they said it was a partisan gerrymander. And so now what you find are all kinds of memos or pronouncements like the one David Lewis gave in North Carolina that say, we're doing this for partisan purposes. Our only intention here is to get the best delegation for our party. And so that it also has a racial impact, right? Because it tends to be that most a large percentages of Blacks and Latinos vote Democratic, so they're able to get away with one by saying they're doing the other, and that is what I worry has been codified in these decisions.
Yeah, from our point of view, we don't like any kind of gerrymandering. So if
No.
you use partisan gerrymandering to justify racial gerrymandering, you've struck out twice from our point of view. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court has said we're staying out of that game until someone passes another law that tells us what we can do about it. So I think I'm going to pivot now to answer the question, what can we do? Thank you, David, again for your talk, and you're gonna stick on and help us with the raffle, which we will do in approximately 3 or 4 minutes here. But folks ask, well, what can we do? So we've started something here in Georgia that you can be involved in, and I'm now going to talk about our pledge campaign. So let me pull those slides up if I can share my screen. I think I'm sharing successfully here, right? Everybody can see that, I think, right? So we've started a pledge campaign. But the objective of our pledge campaign is to get our state legislative candidates signed up to agree to help us reform redistricting along a set of principles. We're not pitching a particular law or a particular solution like a commission right now. What we're saying is that redistricting should be based on a set of principles that's fully transparent, with citizen engagement, fair maps, validated by other outside experts, that do not favor one political party over the other, that do in fact give proper representation to folks across the racial spectrum. We want competitive districts, and we want to end a couple of practices that Georgia has around mid-cycle redistricting and prison gerrymandering. So these are principles. We are asking candidates to sign the pledge. Every candidate for the state legislature in Georgia has received an email asking them to sign this pledge, okay? What you can do is ask your candidates, push them to sign this. There's two things you can do. Now, if you go to their event or a town hall or a meet and greet or a fundraiser, whatever you go to, ask them about this, okay? You can arm yourself with the statewide poll we conducted in 2022, where the overwhelming majority of Georgians say in our poll statistically, they want competitive elections and they want the law to be fixed to get rid of partisan and racial gerrymandering. So take the poll with you. It's a 2-page item. Print it down on the website. You can also take the actual pledge page, if they haven't signed electronically, print it from the website, hand it to them in the meeting and say, could you please sign this pledge? Give them a chance to read it, of course. But if they'll sign it, grab it, get their signature, and then email us that signature back. Or you can tell the candidate, your candidate email that we have on file, got an email. If you reply to that, then you're automatically, if you agree through email, then you are electronically signed up, which is the easier way to do it. So that's something you can do right now to try to get candidates to agree to start working on this problem in Georgia. We just started this. We actually ran this pledge campaign 2 years ago. We're rejuvenating it for this year. We've got a pretty good start. We're actually about 18% out of the state, which isn't bad. It's going to be very difficult to get 100%. There's 355 candidates from all parties. We do this on a nonpartisan basis. We do not track whether it's Democrats or Republicans signing. We just know that's how many we've got signed up so far. So what you can do is help us push this over the line. Get candidates signed up to the pledge so that when they get elected, we can go downtown to the Capitol, up in Atlanta, and say, look, you pledged on this. Here's what we'd like you to do. Now we want to talk about specific legislative solutions that could be brought to bear here. And the more folks that we get signed up, the better we are. I will tell you that some of the candidates who have already signed the pledge had in their platforms already on their websites statements against gerrymandering. So the word is getting out. More candidates are picking this up. And so thank you to those candidates who are doing it. We've got a ways to go to get them all signed up. So that's something that you can do to help us. And we're going to continue to point this out through our newsletters and town halls between now and the end of October and early November when the election happens. So that's something that you can do. I also want to point you to the next town hall that we're going to run. On September 30th, the next town hall is going to be talking about, does Georgia have competitive elections? We believe that some elections in Georgia are competitive. Look at the statewide races. We're a swing state, as David mentioned. Sometimes one party wins, sometimes the other. The question is, how does that play down at the legislative, the district level? And the answer is not so well because the maps are drawn poorly. The question is, could they be drawn better and would it be competitive? I think you're going to be surprised by what we talk about on September 30th. So please join us for that town hall. I want to thank everybody for your support for this program. And I think now we will go ahead and conduct the raffle. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We have, let me pull up the raffle thing here. We have a total of, Pat, if I got this right, we have a total of 15 tickets that were sold. Is that right, Pat?
15 donations, yes.
Yes, 15 tickets that were sold with a donation amount to join the raffle. So David, I need you to choose 5 random numbers between 1 and 15. And why don't you choose them one at a time, and I will call out the person who's the winner of that ticket. And we have your email, but I'm going to call out that person so they know on this meeting that they have won the raffle. So pick us a number between 1 and 15. David, go ahead.
I will unmute. Number two.
Number two. The winner is David Delmonique, djdelm@gmail.com in Lawrenceville. David, you have won one of the copies of the book. Thank you so much. Let's go to another ticket, please.
14.
14 is Michael Koenig,
Oh, I know him.
mkoenig@gmail.com. You know him.
I know Michael. I should have guessed that Michael was here. Michael is everywhere.
Okay. We're
Hi,
telling you in
Michael.
advance, this was not a fix. This was
Hey,
totally.
David.
We had no idea. Michael Koenig, you are winner of a signed copy of Mr. Daly's book. All right, 14. Give us another number, please.
6.
6 is Tammy Williams, Tammy4NYS@gmail.com. Tammy, you're a winner of the book. Thank you for helping us out. One more number, please.
Number 1, because the first person to give money ought to maybe win something.
There you go. Number one is Donna Court, dcourt.rn@gmail.com from Marietta. Donna, you have won a copy of the book, and we need one more ticket pulled, please.
All right, number 11, double ones.
Number 11 is Terry Stalker at hotmail.com. Terry Stalker, hotmail.com from Atlanta. Terry, congratulations. You have also won a copy of David Daly's book. It is 8 o'clock. I know there's other political programming that's going on tonight that some of you may want to watch. I'll say that ours was more exciting because it was more intimate, and B, we were giving away free things. And so thank you very much all for joining us. David, thank you again for your time. The book is a chronicle of a tale that deserves to be read. And so I'll endorse it that way and say we've got 5 readers here already. They're going to get the book. I would encourage everybody who's watching the program to take it, borrow it. Is it available in other formats besides hardcovers or Kindle and so on like that?
It is Kindle, books on tape.
Oh, great.
Your local library, anywhere you.
Yeah, it's worthwhile to learn about all this stuff. So thank you again, David Daly. I'm going to say thank you everybody for joining our program this evening. And with that, we'll close the meeting.